The Agent Michelle Torres story. The bullet shattered the courtroom window at exactly 2:47 p.m., missing Marcus Blake's head by 3 inches. In the chaos that followed, nobody noticed juror number 7 tackle Blake to the ground with the precision of a trained federal agent. Michelle Torres had blown her cover to save the life of a man she was supposed to help convict. Welcome to Justice System USA, where we bring you the untold stories of America's legal system. Before we continue with Michelle's incredible story of duty, deception, and split-second choices, tell me in the comments what city are you watching from today, and if you believe stories of courage under impossible circumstances deserve to be heard. Hit that subscribe button. These stories matter, and your support helps us keep bringing them to light. The making of a guardian. Michelle Torres had never intended to become the kind of person who would sacrifice everything for a stranger. Growing up in East Phoenix, she had watched her immigrant parents work 16-hour days to build a small grocery store into something that could support their family. Her father, Eduardo Torres, had been a police officer in Mexico City before coming to America. Her mother, Carmen, cleaned office buildings at night while raising 3 children during the day. The Torres family understood justice not as an abstract concept, but as the thin line between survival and destruction. Eduardo often told his children stories about the corruption he had witnessed in Mexico: judges who sold verdicts, police who worked for cartels, prosecutors who protected the very criminals they were supposed to convict. In America, he would say, the law means something, but only if good people are willing to defend it. Michelle had taken those words to heart. But it wasn't until her senior year at Arizona State University that she truly understood what they meant. She was studying criminal justice, planning to become a prosecutor, when her younger brother Danny was arrested for drug possession. The charge was bogus. Danny had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, but the public defender assigned to his case was overworked and uninterested in proving his innocence. It was Michelle who spent weeks gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, and building the case that eventually cleared her brother's name. But the experience had opened her eyes to how easily the system could fail innocent people, and how much difference one determined person could make. When FBI recruiters came to her campus, Michelle saw an opportunity to fight corruption at its source. At Quantico, she excelled in courses on organized crime, financial fraud, and undercover operations. Her instructors noted her unusual ability to blend into any environment while maintaining razor-sharp awareness of her surroundings. But it was her psychological profile that set her apart. Most undercover agents were driven by adrenaline or the thrill of deception. Michelle was motivated by something deeper: a profound belief that justice required personal sacrifice, and that someone had to be willing to pay that price. The perfect lie. 6 weeks before the assassination attempt, Michelle had spent 3 days perfecting her cover identity as Elena Rodriguez, a middle school science teacher from suburban Phoenix. The false background was meticulously crafted. She had a rental apartment filled with lesson plans and student artwork, a teaching certificate from Northern Arizona University, and 5 years of fabricated employment records. The FBI had even arranged for her to substitute teach for 2 weeks at a local middle school, giving her authentic stories about classroom management and difficult students. By the time jury selection began, Michelle could discuss the challenges of teaching photosynthesis 8th graders with the same passion she normally reserved for building cases against organized crime figures. The selection process had been nerve-wracking in ways her training hadn't prepared her for. Sitting in that jury pool, surrounded by genuine citizens doing their civic duty, Michelle felt the weight of her deception. These people believed they were participating in democracy's most fundamental process, a jury of peers determining guilt or innocence based solely on evidence and law. Michelle knew better. The FBI had evidence that at least 3 previous trials in this courthouse had been fixed through jury tampering. Judge Robert Harrison was suspected of taking bribes. 2 court clerks were believed to be feeding information to defense attorneys for the right price. The entire system was compromised, and Michelle's job was to document it all while pretending to be an ordinary citizen. When she was selected as juror number 7, Michelle felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and guilt. Her psychological training had prepared her to manipulate the selection process, subtly appearing educated enough to be credible, but not so sophisticated as to intimidate attorneys. She had succeeded in infiltrating the jury, but at the cost of undermining the very democratic process she had sworn to protect. During the first week of testimony, Michelle struggled with the ethical implications of her assignment. Every morning, she sat in the jury box alongside 11 other citizens who believed they were the only thing standing between Marcus Blake and wrongful conviction or unjust acquittal. They took their responsibility seriously, asking thoughtful questions during breaks and carefully reviewing evidence. Michelle found herself genuinely respecting her fellow jurors. There was Robert Chen, a retired engineer who brought a systematic approach to analyzing financial documents. Maria Gonzalez, a nurse who insisted on understanding exactly how the prosecution's timeline worked. James Washington, a construction foreman who asked pointed questions about building contracts that revealed deep industry knowledge. These people were the justice system working as it was supposed to work, citizens setting aside their personal lives to serve their community. And Michelle was lying to them every moment of every day. The innocent man. Marcus Blake was not what Michelle had expected when she read his FBI file. The Bureau's intelligence suggested he was either a sophisticated white-collar criminal or a useful idiot being manipulated by smarter criminals. Neither description matched the man she observed during the first weeks of testimony. Blake was 45 years old, a civil engineering graduate from Arizona State who had worked his way up from junior estimator to chief financial officer at Southwest Desert Construction over 15 years. He had never been arrested, never been sued, never even received a speeding ticket. His credit report showed a man who paid his bills on time, lived below his means, and had been saving methodically for his daughter's college education. But it was Blake's behavior during the trial that convinced Michelle of his innocence. She had observed dozens of guilty defendants over her FBI career, and they all shared certain micro-expressions of guilt when damaging evidence was presented, moments of anger when their lies were challenged, calculation behind their apparent emotion. Blake showed none of these signs. Instead, he displayed the consistent bewilderment of a man who couldn't understand how his life had been turned upside down. When prosecutors presented evidence of financial irregularities at his company, Blake leaned forward with genuine interest, as if he were learning about these problems for the first time. When witnesses testified about his alleged misconduct, he took notes frantically, like someone trying to understand accusations that made no sense. During breaks, Michelle watched Blake interact with his family. His wife Jennifer sat in the front row every day, despite having to arrange childcare for their 8-year-old daughter. She wasn't there for show. Michelle could see the genuine love and concern in her eyes. The way she squeezed her husband's hand during difficult testimony, the protective way she positioned herself between Blake and the reporters who tried to approach him. Blake's elderly parents attended whenever their health allowed. His father, Thomas Blake, was a retired Phoenix police officer who had spent 30 years investigating fraud cases. If his son were guilty of embezzlement, Thomas Blake would know it. Instead, he sat in the gallery with the quiet dignity of a man who knew his son was innocent but couldn't prove it. Most telling was Blake's interaction with his defense attorney, James Mitchell. Guilty defendants often tried to control their defense, suggesting strategies or pressuring lawyers to pursue particular theories. Blake deferred completely to Mitchell's expertise, answering questions honestly, even when the truth was damaging to his case. "I don't understand these financial reports," Blake admitted during one attorney-client conference that Michelle overheard. "I relied on our accounting firm for the details. If there were problems, they should have caught them." It was the response of an innocent man who trusted systems that had failed him, not a guilty man trying to shift blame. The web of corruption. As the trial progressed, Michelle began to notice irregularities that went beyond simple jury tampering. Evidence was presented in an order that didn't make logical sense. Key witnesses gave testimony that seemed rehearsed. Documents appeared and disappeared from evidence lists without explanation. Disturbing was Judge Harrison's behavior. Michelle had observed enough trials to recognize a fair jurist, and Harrison wasn't one. He sustained prosecution objections, on flimsy grounds while allowing prosecutors to introduce evidence that should have been excluded. He rushed defense presentations while giving prosecutors unlimited time to make their points. During one particularly egregious example, Mitchell objected to hearsay evidence that directly implicated Blake in financial misconduct. The objection was textbook correct. Michelle had studied evidence law extensively, but Harrison overruled it without explanation. When Mitchell pressed for clarification, the judge threatened him with contempt. "Mr. Mitchell," Harrison said coldly, "and decide what evidence this jury hears. Your job is to represent your client, not lecture me on the law." Michelle saw Blake's reaction to the exchange: confusion and growing despair. He was beginning to understand that the system wasn't just failing him, it was actively working against him. But the most disturbing pattern Michelle observed was the presence of three men who attended every day of testimony but never took notes, never reacted to evidence, and never spoke to anyone. They sat in different locations each day, always with clear sightlines to the jury and defense table. Michelle's surveillance training told her these were not family members, reporters, or curious citizens. They were professionals conducting reconnaissance. During the third week of testimony, Michelle decided to test her suspicions. She left the courthouse during lunch and walked to a nearby coffee shop, taking a deliberately indirect route that would expose any surveillance. As she suspected, one of the three men followed her at a professional distance. Using classic counter-surveillance techniques, Michelle had been followed by some of the best surveillance specialists in federal law enforcement during her training, and this man was their equal. He maintained distance, used reflective surfaces to monitor her movements, and blended seamlessly into the pedestrian traffic. This wasn't amateur intimidation, it was professional reconnaissance. That evening, Michelle broke protocol for the first time and called her handler, Special Agent in Charge Patricia Anderson. The conversation that followed would change the direction of the entire investigation. The handler's dilemma. Patricia Anderson had been Michelle's supervisor for 3 years, and she understood her agent's instincts better than anyone. When Michelle called with concerns about professional surveillance, Anderson knew the operation had moved beyond simple corruption investigation into something much more dangerous. "Describe them again," Anderson said, listening carefully as Michelle detailed the three men's behavior patterns. "Patricia, these aren't court watchers or intimidation artists. They're conducting operational planning. They know the building layout, security procedures, and sight lines. Someone's preparing for something." Anderson had been hoping Michelle's concerns were paranoia, but her agent's description confirmed intelligence the Bureau had received from other sources. An organized crime family with ties to Southwest Desert Construction had been making inquiries about courthouse security. Contract killers from out of state had been spotted in Phoenix. Someone was planning something violent, and Marcus Blake was the likely target. "Michelle, I need you to listen carefully," Anderson said. "We have intelligence suggesting Blake might be targeted for assassination. If that's true, your cover operation just became a protection detail." The implications hit Michelle immediately. She wasn't just an undercover agent anymore, she was possibly the only thing standing between an innocent man and death. But protecting Blake would require revealing her identity and destroying months of investigative work. "What are my orders?" Michelle asked. Anderson paused before answering. "Officially, your orders are to maintain cover and document any corruption. Unofficially, telling you that Marcus Blake is probably innocent, and if someone kills him, justice dies with him." It was as close to authorization as Anderson could give without violating FBI protocols. Michelle understood she was being given permission to use her judgment, but she would bear full responsibility for the consequences. The assassination plan. Over the next few days, Michelle used every surveillance detection technique she'd learned to map the threat against Blake. The three men were clearly advanced team members, scouting locations and timing for an operation they weren't conducting themselves. The actual assassins would arrive closer to the execution date. Michelle's analysis of the courthouse's vulnerabilities revealed several possible attack scenarios. The most likely was a sniper attack from one of the office buildings across the street. The courthouse's large windows provided clear sight lines to the defendant's table, and afternoon sun angles would give a sniper-perfect concealment. Alternative scenarios included a car bomb in the parking garage, poisoning of Blake's food or water, or a close-range attack during arrival or departure. Each possibility required different countermeasures, and Michelle couldn't prepare for all of them without revealing her identity. The psychological pressure was enormous. Every morning, Michelle watched Blake enter the courtroom, knowing that each day might be his last. She saw his wife kiss him goodbye, not knowing whether she would see him alive again. She observed his daughter's drawings taped to his legal folder, stick figures of their family with, "I love you, Daddy," in crayon. Blake had no idea he was living on borrowed time. The threats his attorney had reported to the court were vague and unspecific, typical harassment that many high-profile defendants received. Judge Harrison's refusal to provide protection seemed callous, but not necessarily corrupt. Only Michelle knew that professional killers were planning his death. The moral weight of her knowledge was crushing. She possessed information that could save an innocent man's life, but using it would destroy an investigation that could prevent dozens of future wrongful convictions. Every FBI protocol said to maintain cover and trust the system to protect witnesses through official channels. But Michelle knew the system had already failed Blake. The corruption investigation had revealed that courthouse security was compromised, that judges could be bought, and that organized crime had infiltrated every level of the judicial process. Official protection would be worthless if the people providing it were working for Blake's enemies, the family behind the target. As Michelle struggled with her impossible situation, she found herself paying closer attention to Blake's family. Jennifer Blake attended every day of testimony, sitting in the front row with a dignity that reminded Michelle of her own mother. She was a high school English teacher who had taken unpaid leave to support her husband through the trial. During breaks, Michelle overheard conversations that revealed the toll the case was taking on the Blake family. They had mortgaged their house to pay legal fees. Jennifer was working evenings at a tutoring center to make ends meet. Their daughter Sarah was being teased at school about her father's criminal charges. "I don't understand why this is happening to us," Jennifer confided to Blake's sister during one recess. "Marcus is the most honest person I know. He won't even take home office supplies from work." Blake's parents, Thomas and Margaret, were in their 70s and struggling with health problems exacerbated by stress. Thomas Blake, the retired police officer, looked particularly haunted. He had spent his career arresting criminals, and now he was watching his innocent son be railroaded by a corrupt system. "I know what guilty looks like," Thomas told Margaret during one lunch break. "Marcus isn't guilty, but I don't know how to prove it." 8-year-old Sarah Blake occasionally attended proceedings when school was out. She would sit between her mother and grandmother, coloring in a drawing book and occasionally looking up at her father with confused eyes. She was too young to understand the charges, but old enough to know that something terrible was happening to her family. Michelle's heart broke watching Sarah. The little girl reminded her of herself at that age: dark hair, serious eyes, and complete faith that adults would protect her from harm. If Blake was killed, Sarah would grow up believing that her father was a criminal who died before he could be punished. The truth would die with him. The injustice of it consumed Michelle's thoughts. She had joined the FBI to protect innocent people from criminals. Now, she was watching criminals destroy an innocent family while she maintained a cover identity that prevented her from helping. The moment of choice. On the morning of what would become known as the courthouse incident, Michelle arrived at the building knowing that something was different. The 3 reconnaissance men were nowhere to be seen, but they had been replaced by 2 new faces, younger men with the controlled alertness of military veterans turned mercenaries. Blake looked worse than usual. His attorney had informed him that the prosecution would rest their case that afternoon, meaning the defense would begin tomorrow. The pressure of maintaining innocence in the face of overwhelming circumstantial evidence was visibly breaking him down. During the morning session, Michelle noticed unusual activity in the office building across the street. Window washers who weren't washing windows, construction workers who weren't constructing anything, delivery trucks that made no deliveries, Someone was using multiple cover identities to position assets for an operation. At lunch, Mitchell made one final plea to Judge Harrison for protection. Your Honor, we have credible intelligence that Mr. Blake's life is in danger. I'm requesting immediate police protection and consideration of moving proceedings to a secure location. Harrison's response was swift and final. Mr. Mitchell, this court will not be held hostage by unsubstantiated threats and conspiracy theories. Your client will receive the same protection as any other defendant, which is to say, he'll be safe. As long as he remains in this courtroom. Michelle saw Blake's face fall as he realized that no one in authority would help him. He was alone, facing not just wrongful conviction, but possible death, with only his overmatched attorney standing between him and destruction. The afternoon session began at 2:30 p.m. with final prosecution testimony. Michelle noticed that courthouse security guards had been repositioned in ways that suggested official concern about potential threats. But the positioning was all wrong. They were preparing for a ground-level attack, not a sniper assault from above. At 2:45 p.m., Michelle saw a flash of reflected sunlight from the office building across the street. She had perhaps 2 seconds to act. Every instinct screamed at her to maintain cover. Blowing her identity would end her FBI career and destroy months of investigative work. The corruption investigation was more important than any single defendant. The greater good required her to sacrifice Blake for the sake of future justice. But as Michelle watched Blake lean forward to speak with his attorney, presenting a perfect target for assassination, she realized that justice delayed was justice denied. All the future good in the world couldn't justify watching an innocent man die when she had the power to save him. Michelle Torres stood up from the jury box and shouted, "Everyone get down." The aftermath of truth. The bullet came through the window. 17 seconds later, shattering glass and embedding itself in the wall exactly where Blake's head had been. Michelle had already launched herself over the jury box railing, tackling Blake to the ground with enough force to knock the wind out of both of them. In the chaos that followed, screaming, running, security officers shouting orders, Michelle positioned herself over Blake's body and scanned the room for additional threats. Her FBI training had kicked in completely, and she was no longer pretending to be a middle school teacher named Elena Rodriguez. She was Special Agent Michelle Torres, and her only priority was keeping Blake alive. "Stay down," she told Blake, who was staring at her with shock and confusion. "There might be additional shooters." "Who are you?" Blake gasped. "Someone who knows you're innocent," Michelle replied, never taking her eyes off potential danger zones. Within minutes, FBI agents were swarming the courthouse. Anderson had positioned tactical teams around the building based on Michelle's earlier intelligence, and they moved with practiced efficiency to secure the scene and pursue the attackers. The sniper was arrested 3 blocks away, along with 2 spotters who had been feeding him information about timing and positioning. The assassination team was professional, but not prepared for the kind of coordinated response the FBI had organized. As paramedics checked Blake for injuries, he was shaken but unhurt. Michelle found herself surrounded by fellow agents who looked at her with a mixture of admiration and concern. She had blown the biggest undercover operation of her career, but she had also prevented a murder in open court. "Are you all right?" Anderson asked when she arrived at the scene. "I'm fine," Michelle replied, "but we need to get Blake into protective custody immediately." This was just the first attempt, the conspiracy revealed. The investigation that followed the courthouse shooting revealed a conspiracy far more extensive than anyone had imagined. The assassination attempt wasn't just about silencing Blake, it was about protecting a criminal network that had been stealing millions of dollars from construction projects across Arizona. Southwest Desert Construction, the company where Blake worked, was a legitimate business that had been infiltrated by organized crime. The criminals were using the company to launder money from drug trafficking and illegal gambling operations. When Blake, in his role as CFO, began asking questions about irregularities in the books, he became a threat that had to be eliminated. The frame-up for embezzlement was designed to discredit Blake before he could expose the money laundering operation. If he was convicted, his testimony about financial irregularities would be worthless. Who would believe a convicted embezzler? If he was acquitted, the backup plan was assassination disguised as revenge by angry investors. Judge Harrison's corruption was even deeper than the FBI had suspected. He had been taking bribes not just to fix trials, but to ensure that certain cases never came to trial at all. Witnesses against organized crime figures had their cases delayed until they could be intimidated into silence or eliminated entirely. The three men who had been conducting surveillance were advanced team members for a murder-for-hire organization based in Las Vegas. They had been planning Blake's assassination for weeks, studying courthouse security and mapping escape routes. The shooting through the window was just one of several attack scenarios they had prepared. Blake himself had been completely unaware of the criminal activity at his company. His role as CFO had been compartmentalized to keep him away from the money laundering operations. He had been chosen as a scapegoat precisely because his honesty and integrity made him a credible fall guy for financial crimes he had never committed. The price of justice. Michelle's decision to blow her cover had consequences that rippled through the FBI and the justice system. The corruption investigation she had been conducting was severely compromised, though the courthouse shooting provided evidence of criminal activity that might not have been obtainable through traditional surveillance. Internal Affairs opened an investigation into Michelle's conduct, focusing on her decision to prioritize Blake's safety over operational security. While her actions had saved a life and exposed criminal activity, they had also violated direct orders and compromised ongoing investigations. The review process was emotionally exhausting. Michelle sat through hours of interviews where she was forced to justify split-second decisions and explain why she had chosen one man's life over potentially larger investigative goals. Some supervisors argued that maintaining cover might have led to arrests of more criminals in the long term, but Anderson stood by her agent throughout the process. Michelle Torres made the right choice. She testified before the review board. "We train our agents to uphold justice, not to sacrifice innocent lives for bureaucratic goals. If we punish agents for saving people, we lose everything that makes this job worth doing." The media attention was intense and unwelcome. Michelle's identity as an undercover FBI agent became public knowledge, effectively ending her career in covert operations. She received both praise for heroism and criticism for violating procedure. Death threats from organized crime figures forced her into protective custody for several months. Blake's reaction to learning Michelle's true identity was complex. He was grateful for her intervention, but troubled by the deception. "I understand why she had to lie," he said during one interview. "But it's hard to know that someone was watching my family suffer while pretending to be just another juror." The psychological toll on Michelle was severe. She had spent months lying to decent people who trusted her, and the weight of that deception didn't disappear just because she had ultimately done the right thing. She sought counseling to deal with the guilt and identity confusion that followed. Her exposure. Justice delayed, justice served. Blake's trial was declared a mistrial due to the courthouse shooting and subsequent revelations about judicial corruption. The charges against him were dropped entirely when investigators found evidence that he had been deliberately kept away from the money laundering operations at his company. The real criminals were gradually brought to justice over the following months. Judge Harrison was convicted of accepting bribes and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. The money laundering network was dismantled, with 17 people convicted of various charges related to organized crime and corruption. The assassination team members faced federal charges for attempted murder and conspiracy. The sniper who fired the shot received a life sentence. The spotters and advanced team members received sentences ranging from 20 to 40 years. Blake became a protected witness in multiple federal investigations, helping prosecutors understand how organized crime had infiltrated legitimate businesses across the Southwest. His testimony was crucial in convicting several high-ranking crime family members who had thought they were immune from prosecution. The personal cost to the Blake family was enormous, but not permanent. The stress of the trial and assassination attempt strained Blake's marriage. but Jennifer Blake stood by her husband throughout the ordeal. Their daughter Sarah required counseling to deal with the trauma of seeing her father nearly killed in court. Financially, the family eventually recovered through wrongful prosecution settlement and victim compensation funds. Blake found new employment with a construction company that valued his integrity and experience. Most importantly, he was alive to see his daughter grow up and to rebuild the life that criminals had tried to destroy. The new assignment. Michelle Torres faced a career crossroads after the courthouse incident. Her cover work was over organized crime figures across the country now knew her face and identity. But her experience in the Blake case had given her unique insights into witness protection and judicial security. The FBI offered her a position with the Witness Security Program, where her skills in threat assessment and protective operations were highly valued. Michelle accepted, recognizing that her new role would allow her to help other innocent people who found themselves targeted by criminals. Her first case was protecting a family in Oregon whose father had testified against a drug trafficking organization. The parallels to Blake's situation were obvious. An honest man who had stumbled onto criminal activity and was being targeted for elimination. This time, Michelle was officially authorized to do whatever was necessary to keep the family safe. The work was satisfying in ways that undercover operations had never been. Instead of deceiving good people, Michelle was openly protecting them. Instead of gathering evidence for future prosecutions, she was preventing crimes from happening. Instead of serving institutional goals, she was serving justice directly. Anderson was proud of how Michelle had adapted to her new role. "You found your calling," she told Michelle during a performance review. "Some agents are meant to gather intelligence. Others are meant to kick down doors. You're meant to stand between innocent people and the criminals who want to hurt them." Michelle's reputation within the FBI grew as word spread about her willingness to sacrifice career advancement for principle. Young agents sought her out for mentoring, asking how to balance competing loyalties and impossible choices. Her answer was always the same: remember why you took the oath. Everything else is just paperwork. The continuing battle. Years after the courthouse shooting, Michelle continued to work in witness protection while following the ongoing prosecutions that had resulted from Blake's case. The corruption network had been larger than anyone imagined, with tentacles reaching into multiple states and federal agencies. New cases continued to emerge as witnesses found the courage to come forward. Blake's survival and the successful prosecution of his attackers had sent a message that the FBI would protect people who cooperated with investigations. Other victims of the same criminal network began telling their stories. Michelle often thought about the moment when she had stood up from the jury box and shouted the warning that saved Blake's life. It had been the defining moment of her career, not because of the dramatic heroics, but because it represented a choice between institutional loyalty and moral responsibility. The FBI had trained her to gather intelligence, follow orders, and serve the greater good. But that training had to compete with deeper values instilled by her parents: the belief that individuals matter, that justice is personal, and that good people must be willing to sacrifice for others. Blake's case had taught her that sometimes the most important investigations aren't the ones planned in conference rooms or authorized by supervisors. They're the ones that happen when ordinary circumstances collide with extraordinary moral choices, and people have to decide what they're really willing to sacrifice for justice. Michelle kept a photo on her desk from Blake's daughter's high school graduation. Sarah Blake had grown up to become a social worker, dedicating her life to helping families in crisis. In the photo, she was wearing her cap and gown, standing between her parents with a smile that showed no trace of the trauma she had endured. As a child, "Thank you for giving me my father back," Sarah had written on the back of the photo. "Because of you, he was able to walk me down the aisle at my wedding and will be there to see his grandchildren grow up." Some people think heroes wear capes. I know they sometimes wear jury badges. The legacy of choice. Michelle Torres never regretted her decision to blow her cover and save Marcus Blake's life. The investigation she had compromised was eventually completed through other means. The criminals she might have caught were caught anyway. But Blake was alive because she had chosen principle over procedure, and that made all the difference. her story became part of FBI training curricula used to teach new agents about the complexities of undercover work and the importance of moral flexibility in impossible situations. Michelle occasionally lectured at Quantico, always emphasizing the same point: your job is to serve justice, not to serve institutions. Sometimes they're the same thing, sometimes they're not. You have to be smart enough to know the difference. The courthouse where she had saved Blake's life underwent major security renovations and corruption prevention reforms. A plaque in the main lobby honored all those who choose courage over convenience in service of justice, though it didn't mention Michelle by name. She preferred it that way. Blake occasionally spoke at law enforcement conferences about his experience, always emphasizing the importance of agents who were willing to put humanity before bureaucracy. "Agent Torres saved my life," he would say, "but more than that, she saved my family's faith in justice. She showed us that even when systems fail, there are still people who will do the right thing." Michelle continued her work in witness protection, building a reputation as someone who would move heaven and earth to keep innocent people safe. She never sought publicity or recognition, preferring to measure success by the number of families who remained alive and intact under her protection. The moral complexity of her choice in Blake's case never disappeared. There were still nights when she wondered if maintaining cover might have led to greater long-term justice. But those doubts were always overcome by the knowledge that she had saved an innocent man's life and preserved a family's faith in the system she had sworn to serve. What would you have done in Michelle's position that day? When duty conflicts with conscience, when following orders means watching someone die, when institutional loyalty competes with moral responsibility, how do you choose? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know what city you're watching from today. If this story moved you, subscribe to Justice System USA. We're committed to sharing the untold stories of courage, sacrifice, and moral complexity within America's legal system. Every subscription helps us continue bringing these important stories to light. Stories that remind us why individual conscience matters as much as institutional procedure. Until next time, remember that sometimes the most important badge isn't the one issued by organizations, but the moral courage carried in the human heart. Michelle Torres proved that justice isn't just about following rules, it's about knowing when to break them for something more important than career advancement or institutional loyalty. The courthouse where she made her choice still serves justice today, a little more secure and a lot more honest, because one person chose truth over safety, principle over procedure, and life over protocol. That's how justice really works, not through perfect systems, but through imperfect people making the right choices when everything they value is on the line.